Today I went through my old parts tray just to see if there's anything I could reuse. Then, after digging around, I found this old speaker driver. Still intact, but it's been sitting there so long, I honestly can't remember where it came from. Keeping it feels pointless. Throwing away feels like a waste. So, the best option is to give it a brand new purpose. This position is the speaker terminal. In a moment, you will know its effect. Here, I already have 2 spark plugs. Let's put them on the table for later. Next, I take a piece of copper wire and wrap it around the thread of the spark plug and its ground electrode. Important note, leave a short extra piece of wire sticking out. We'll need it later. Don't just rush through this step. Take a second, breathe, and do it properly. The wire needs to be tight enough so it makes good contact, but not so tight that you end up snapping it or stripping the spark plug. Think of it like tying your shoelaces. You want it secure, not strangled. Nobody likes broken shoelaces, and nobody likes broken wires either. That little extra bit of wire sticking out may look messy right now, but trust me, later on it's going to save us a headache. If you've ever cut a cable too short and then spent the next 20 minutes regretting your life choices, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A short wire gives you nothing to hold on to, nothing to solder, nothing to fix. It's like trying to grab a slippery bar of soap in the shower. Completely useless. Now I fix both spark plugs onto the body of the speaker using hot glue. Quick, simple, and sturdy. No fancy tools required. Speaking of hot glue, did you know that some universities in Europe recently used this exact material in their plastic recycling experiments? It sounds funny, but hot glue is often called the lifesaver material for small projects because it's cheap, easy to find, and not toxic. And spark plugs? Well, just a few months ago, news outlets reported an interesting story. In a rural part of South America, a group of young people reused old spark plugs to build mini wind-powered generators. Something that most people think is only for igniting engines ended up becoming a green energy solution for an isolated community. With a little creativity, they sometimes become part of surprising world news stories. The 2 copper ends sticking out, I solder them onto the speaker terminals. On the screen, you can clearly see those small rectangular silver white tabs. That's where the amplifier's signal connects directly into the voice coil inside the speaker. A solid solder joint ensures no loss and no static noise. All right, soldering done. Next step. And here it is, the step drill bit. Anyone here who has used one of these before? Drop a comment below. Now, let's make the antenna whiskers. Just take the copper wire, wrap it in a spiral, and use the drill bit's surface as a mold. Easy, neat, and evenly shaped. But while I'm twisting this little wire, let me tell you something funny about copper. Last year, there was this wild news story in Germany. Someone stole several tons of copper cable straight off a construction site. Not just a few spools, tons. Enough to literally shut down part of the railway system for hours. Trains stopped, commuters were late, and all because someone decided copper wire was worth the effort of hauling away by the truckload. And here's the irony. In our so-called wireless world, copper is more important than ever. Every phone, every internet cable, every wireless router you use, it all still depends on copper somewhere in the background. It's like the invisible backbone of modern life. So, while I'm spiraling this little piece for an antenna, halfway across the world entire trains are being delayed because people can't get enough of the same metal. And it's not just Germany. A few years ago, reports came out from South Africa about thieves targeting power lines just to strip out the copper inside. Whole neighborhoods lost electricity because someone wanted to sell scrap metal. Imagine sitting at home, lights flickering out, and the reason is not a storm, not maintenance, just copper disappearing into the back of a pickup truck. That's the strange thing about this simple, shiny wire. In one place, it's a high-tech energy crisis. In another, it's just me making funny little antenna whiskers on my workbench. Kind of humbling, isn't it? This tiny spiral I'm shaping right now is obviously not going to power a city, but it does remind you how much the world still quietly runs on copper. All right, spiral's done. Let's move on. I fixed this antenna coil to the back of the speaker driver with hot glue. Watch the screen closely. It's easier to follow than me over-explaining it. Let me tell you something about being cautious when buying secondhand items at flea markets or online. It sounds simple. You think you're saving money, but in reality, it's not always that easy. I once had a friend in Ohio who bought a used amplifier, thinking he just needed to clean it up a little. But when he opened it, the copper wires had been replaced with cheap substitutes, and the solder joints were barely holding together. A week later, it burned out, right in the middle of his family's Christmas music night. And that story isn't rare. American news outlets have reported plenty of cases where secondhand electronics were secretly modified, unsafe, and underpowered compared to the original. You don't lose a fortune, sure, but you risk a lot more than money. So if you ever buy secondhand gear, check it carefully. Don't let a shiny exterior fool you. A little caution now might save you a month of frustration later. Time for the power connection. I've got an old charger brick and a broken cable. Inside the cable there are 4 tiny wires, but we only need 2. Cut the other 2 off to keep things tidy. Since these wires are very thin, be gentle when stripping off the insulation or you'll snap the core. After that, solder the remaining 2 wires onto the speaker terminals, just like you see on screen. Now, let me slow down here for a moment because every time I do this step, it reminds me of how much waste we create without even noticing. You see this old charger I'm using? It was in a box of junk electronics a neighbor left by the curb. Perfectly good. Still charges fine. But they tossed it out just because the plastic casing had a little crack. Back in 2018, NBC ran a story saying Americans throw away over 140 million phone chargers every single year. That's not even counting cables. And when you think about it, that's miles of copper wire, literally enough to wrap around the earth several times, just sitting in landfills. All because people don't want to bother fixing or reusing. And here's the funny part. That same report interviewed a guy who collected broken cables and repaired them in his garage. He was selling them online for $1 each. Just $1. And he ended up making enough side income to cover his rent for 2 years straight. Imagine that, paying your rent just from other people's trash. All set, now let's test it. Look closely. The TV screen is clearly showing no signal. And the result? Honestly, it surprised me. This thing actually picks up signal. You see the copper coil and those 2 spark plugs. Together they form a small resonant circuit like a tiny homemade antenna. When radio waves travel through the air and hit that coil, they get nudged, amplified just enough, and passed into the speaker. From there, the TV is able to catch and decode the signal. Now, I notice some of you this sounds like black magic, but it's not magic, it's just physics. Old-fashioned, textbook physics that never fails. The speaker, which was originally designed just to play sound, suddenly becomes the middleman. The unexpected bridge between invisible waves in the air and the television in your living room. I've lived through decades of technology, from the rabbit ear antennas back in the 70s, to satellite dishes the size of a car in the 80s, to flat digital antennas today that you can buy for $20. Yet here I am, holding a spark plug and a chunk of copper wire, and it does the same thing. Isn't that something? This reminds me of a story. Back in the early 2000s, after a storm knocked out power in my town, people dug through their garages looking for any way to catch radio updates. One neighbor even used the metal frame of his lawn chair as an antenna. And guess what? It worked. That's when I learned. Never underestimate what simple metal and wires can do when the air is buzzing with radio waves. So what you're seeing here is not just a fun trick, but a reminder of how resilient technology can be. You don't always need fancy tools or expensive gadgets. Sometimes the junk in your garage is all the answers. If you found this little experiment interesting, I'd appreciate it if you hit like, maybe subscribe, and share with a friend. That way, I'll have the motivation to keep digging through piles of forgotten stuff. And maybe next time, we'll stumble upon something even crazier together.